of why the structure of this game just doesn't work is the rising action. For those of you who don't know, rising action is basically the narrative tension. It's the way conflict builds as the story goes along. In any well-structured plot, the rising action will look like this. The story starts off pretty calm, then the inciting incident happens and kicks off the plot, and from here the conflict builds like a snowball rolling down a hill until the tension is so high that the climax happens, and then there's a gradual wind down as the story ties up its loose ends. Rising action is a universal thing in storytelling. It doesn't matter what your genre is or what your target audience is, or hell, what medium you're telling the story in, your story simply needs rising action. On this, there's a reason why when you watch a movie with two plot lines, you'll have a scene or two with Frodo, then a scene or two with Aragorn, then back to Frodo, then Aragorn, and so on like that until the story ends. Because if you spent the entire story following just Frodo and Sam, all the way up until halfway through the trilogy when they've reached Mount Doom, and then you suddenly stop, go back, and then we see what Aragorn was doing the whole time, and then we spend essentially the rest of the trilogy following just Aragorn until he catches up with Frodo at the end, there's a reason why you don't see that happen very often in fiction, because it's almost impossible to do that and maintain a good rising action. I say almost because I really hate to say that anything's absolute in writing, but I've yet to see a story that attempts this and actually pulls it off. Okay, so if we had to plot the rising action of The Last of Us 2, it would look like this. Honestly, the first half of the game with Ellie is pretty decent. We have a quiet opening as we introduce all the characters, then wham, Joel dies. There's our inciting incident which makes Ellie go out on her revenge mission, and then as she goes out, the narrative tension rises as she gets close to Abby. Then after stabbing plenty of cuddly dogs, we finally meet Abby and it feels like the climax is just about to happen. Then the rising action goes down so fast, it's literally a vertical line. We have now switched protagonists to Abby, and the next 10 hours of gameplay is following just her in the days before Ellie's plot even started. And this is a point we'll look at in a moment, but because Abby's half of the story isn't working towards an overall objective, rather she's doing what feels like a series of side quests all placed back to back, Abby has no real sense of rising action in her story because she doesn't actually have a goal she's working towards. So for Abby, because her story is so directionless, the narrative tension is mostly just a straight line for about 8 hours of gameplay, until she finally finds the bodies of her friends that Ellie killed, then it finally shoots up, she almost immediately fights Ellie, we have a climactic fight, and then we have our epilogue where things wind down. But oh no, Ellie still wants Abby dead, so then the rising action goes back up again, and then we have a second climax, and then it goes down when the story ends. What you're seeing on screen is an abomination of story structure. What would have been a far better execution of this story was to do what books and movies have been doing for hundreds of years and tell the two stories in parallel, where we have an hour as Ellie, then an hour as Abby, then Ellie, then Abby, and so on back and forth until the climax happens and resolves everything, which removes the need for that second climax, and then the story ends. If they did something like that, it would have made the structure look far closer to the ideal one that I just described earlier, as both plots harmonise together and both build to the same climax at the same time. Instead,